Hi, you've tuned into CKUW 95.9 FM here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I'm the host, Tammy Wolf of Truth Before Reconciliation. I have Angela Lavallee here with me today. She is an advocate and she's actually a previous guest. So she has joined us before here on Truth Before Reconciliation. So welcome, Angela.
Thank you.
So Angela, I thought maybe, I don't know if anybody remembers you. I think this was like all the way back in 2019, which is like 2 long years ago already. I can't believe I've been doing this show this long. But last time you came in, you talked a little bit. I think we also focused on the topic of MMIWG. So I thought maybe you could just start with reminding the listeners who you are and telling them a little bit about yourself and how you became to be an advocate and a community helper for MMIWG.
Okay. Thank you, Tammy, and thank you for doing the work that you do with and for community. My name is Angela Lavallee. One of the spirit names that I carry right now, I have 3. One of the spirit names that I carry right now is for grandmother's woman. I'm originally from the north. I grew up in Cornwall, Manitoba. I'm a grandmother, I'm a mother, a sister. Within the capacity of supporting community, I support the community with as a survivor. I've taken everything that I've learned through my healing, and I'll be healing until the day I die. I think we even spoke about that the last time we connected. And so I'm an advocate in a variety of capacities. And unfortunately, we, as Indigenous women, we have a lot of similar experiences. Overcoming violence is one. So taking those experiences and sitting with people who are implicitly exploring their bodies. So through focus therapy, as well as I do a lot of support with women who are fleeing violence, and as well as some terms on MMIWG2S board, and one of the Manitoba co-chairs for the Manitoba Coalition for Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls and Two-Spirited. So part of how I've become involved and as an advocate, I think when I was reflecting, I was thinking about how some of us are just born into that way.
Right.
Because of the way that our lives are, that we watch everything around us, or we're constantly advocating for ourselves, whether that be in the education system. Like I recall a long time ago in the 80s, having to advocate without knowing what I was doing.
Right.
So I think it goes back, like it's within our youth, and it's in our blood, and it's so yeah, it's just unfortunately how I become a family member was when my granddaughter was we know she was murdered, taken from us, and as well as supporting as a survivor of somebody who has overcome many forms of violence.
Right. So your work is just so important, and you have such a large range of just different experiences, and then also like lived experience too. And just so want to give you my condolences again as well. I know that we've talked about this in the past. We also have very similar stories in that regard as well. And so, I mean, that was kind of what we had discussed about having it on the show today, to kind of, I guess, talk and kind of unravel some of that for the listeners. And so I thought maybe we would kind of just jump right into talking a little bit about deaths undetermined and how that relates to MMIWG2S, because as I mentioned, we both have very similar stories. I know myself, we had shared my mother's story here on Truth Before Reconciliation. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And just to honor Zaylin's name, little flower, she was She was born in 2014, and she was taken on April 24th, 2015. So part of the deaths deemed undetermined when it comes to murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited, it is a part of it's how do I say it? I guess you could say when it comes to a lot of the issues around murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited, there's even though we have so many similar stories, there
Mhm.
are different experiences. There's different things that happen out there. And when it comes to stories like we talked about with your mother and with Zaylin, the deaths that are deemed undetermined are usually not added to those numbers, because
Right.
there's that area that in order for somebody to be even to say the word murdered,
Right.
that somebody was murdered, we don't have the backup of the court system. We don't have the backup of the medical examiner report. We don't have the backup of the police. So we are kind of just left on our own.
Right.
And we become experts in putting those stories together and finding out what really happened that night. We also become experts in reading these autopsy reports and questioning why they're written the way they are.
For
um,
sure.
and we also understand that if we had the money, how many reports would we be getting? When we reflect on, we're given one autopsy report from a medical examiner that's where the death is deemed undetermined. And even to understand what does that mean? It
Mhm.
means that they can't confirm how that person died because there were so many injuries or there were so many things going on within that they can't determine. So they can really pinpoint how or when that person was murdered or died.
Right.
In some cases, from what I understand, some people you you can't determine if there was a homicide or if it was accidental. It could
Right.
be either or, so they put undetermined. And unfortunately, for some policing services, once they get that death deemed undetermined, they will not move forward with an investigation, or they'll just stop. I also understand there are some police forces who will just move ahead and continue investigating, even with the autopsy report, regardless of what it says,
For sure.
because they're their own policing body. But the medical examiners, they have a lot of power and a lot of work that they do on their part in order to get justice for our loved ones, in order to, provide us with answers. They're one doorway. They're an essential doorway. They are the medical experts.
Right.
And I don't think there's enough focus on that key part. And when we also look at the medical examiner, and their job in it all, they're one of the first responders with the family when they're at the hospital.
For sure.
In many cases, the medical examiner will not even meet or greet the family. They have all the say whether we can be traditionally or culturally appropriate with our loved ones' bodies. Or they can go and they can tell the police, no, don't let anybody in because this is what we're doing.
Mhm.
They have the say on what happens with the remains, how long the remains will be there.
For sure.
So there's,
That firsthand contact is
yeah,
not was non-existent in our case for sure. Didn't ever
mhm,
see her face to face, not once.
not once, not once. We knew she was there. We kept hearing, oh, the medical examiner, never met that person, don't know who they are. Um, other than the letter. It took for Zaylin, she died on April 24th, 2015. I did not get a copy of the report. I started requesting it, and finally, with numerous phone calls, I think in October, in
Wow.
2015, they finally I think, acknowledged that I was looking for the autopsy report and seeking it. So they
Right.
finally mailed me a copy of it a year later, a year and a month later.
Right.
And when I opened it, there were even like the basic simple things. There were many holes in that autopsy report. So I had
Sure.
called back and I had said there are, even the way the name was spelled and who they said her father was. And I said this needs to be corrected. So they sent me another copy.
Mm-hmm.
But they were the contact. I was often guided to them from the police service. You have to talk to the medical examiner. We're waiting for that report.
Right.
Uh, then they would send me back. No, no, no. There's going to be a death review committee because she was under the age of 1. And then I would go to the death review committee that was under the Children's Advocacy,
Right.
um, as well as they also have a youth committee, like death for young people who have died under a certain age.
Right.
I was ping pong back to the medical examiner. So I felt like a ping pong ball going to these different areas, as well as I would never forget early in the phone calls, one of the medical examiners that I was in contact with, she actually had she had to have time off because something, I think she broke her foot or something, or sprained she had to get a cast. So
Right.
it was somebody else that started answering my calls as a concerned grandma because we knew what had happened. We knew that the police needed to start investigating. They should have actually been investigating before the autopsy report came out.
Right.
Uh, so early on, I know it was in the fall, and I was sitting and I was phoning in between. I was on a work errand and I had called, and then he goes, yes, I've been getting your messages. And he was telling me, he goes, we're not done the autopsy report. He said, but just know there will not be an inquiry. And
Really.
I didn't even mention the word inquiry to this medical examiner. And I didn't know where that was coming from, but I kind of suspected he must have been familiar with something. And then I said, well, how do you even determine if there's going to be an inquiry if the autopsy report is not done or completed?
Right.
And then he just like brushed me off. So the phone calls became very vague, are not answered. And then finally, I think it was near her 1 year when she was murdered, the 1 year um, of when she died, that I phoned and I said, I said, I bet if the media knew about Zaylen's story or had any any word about how this young baby, Indigenous baby, died, and there's these circumstances and no autopsy report, I bet you it would have been quicker. I would already have that autopsy report if she was in the front news, or if her body was bloody, because
Right.
sometimes when our loved ones die, it's done so internally, like the damage to their bodies, they're not always bloody. So it
Mhm.
doesn't look graphic, but it's painful. And you hear what happens. You hear what happens by the people who were there that night, because they're not going to the police. They're going to me because I'm out there asking questions. Um,
The police are sometimes not safe to go to.
So there was a lot of questions around her, what had happened. And I was basically just a ping pong ball, finding out what had happened to her that night. And I have a very clear picture after speaking to, you know, my daughter, as well as a couple of other people who were there that evening, and my daughter's best friend.
Right.
So the police have never, from what I understand, interviewed any of those people.
Hmm.
So they never, when I had called, they kept telling me, we're waiting for the autopsy report. We're waiting for the autopsy report. I
Right.
didn't get the autopsy report until May. So that's a year later.
Right. Yeah, that just, it seems with, kind of unraveling your story, it just seems like questions, you know what I mean? Even in my mind, hearing this story and then even hearing about, these organizations or these advocates, you would think that you would have had support from those places. Like in my mind, that's where I go, especially with such a young person or a young child, like a young baby. You would think that those organizations would be there advocating for you on your behalf. And the fact that, I think something that's important to note is that, these are traumatic situations where people are placed in a place where they're having to advocate on their own in a very troubling time, in a very traumatic time, in a very it's challenging. It's beyond challenging to have to be an advocate and to be doing that when they obviously have systems in place, those advocacy groups, or there's those groups that are focused on children. You think that they would be stepping up to do their part to try to get you some answers. And that just doesn't seem like that happened.
Yeah. And that's why I always said I felt like a ping pong ball. I always felt like I was a nuisance.
Right.
And you shouldn't feel like that when you are trying to. One of the things that was really important to me was knowing that the man who was last with her, the person who had brought down her body when she was crying, and it's raw and it's real, and people need to know those stories that there's a baby crying, and the last person who went to be with her to calm her down was somebody who was abusing her mother, was somebody who was actually already a red flag for abusing her older sister. And apparently the autopsy reads that her ribs were broken due to somebody who was not trained giving her CPR. If the police would have investigated, they would have known that at the time when he was claiming he was doing CPR to her, he was actually looking out the window, watching my daughter freak out because her daughter was not breathing. And he was holding the phone, looking out the window. And this comes directly from my daughter's friend, who was standing right there on the phone with 911 as well. So there's so many questions.
Well, and that's the thing is the families know. And I mean, within my own research, within my own study, in my own meeting other families like myself who have been impacted, the families know the same way that my family knows who the suspects are, what happened. We've uncovered, this evidence that we've looked for, like we've looked for things that, it's troubling, right? It's troubling. So I did want to ask you why you think it's important for people to hear these stories. So why is Zaylen's story so important? Why is it still a part of that truth telling process? They did the inquiry and, they closed that truth telling process, but really we're still telling our stories. So why is that important?
I think it's important because there needs to be this understanding when you depend on one pod or one circle to help bring justice and to help keep other young people safe, young, Indigenous women and girls, that there needs to be, a focus on those spaces that are holding that door open or closed. When we have Western medicine that's determining, like doing an autopsy report and taking all of these tissues and parts of our loved ones' bodies to put it under a microscope and, to take it apart and to determine how they have died. But there's conflict there because there's just so much, or maybe there's nothing. And then knowing that medically it's an ongoing learning study, there's never an ending. We're always learning something new when it comes to academia, or when it comes to the medical system. So even to understand that one autopsy report or one medical examiner can read one way, but then you'll have conflicting, you know, a conflicting a conflicting report come out from another entity or another body.
Right.
So it's important that stories like Zaylin are told, are part of the ongoing truth telling process, because it's still happening. Because
Right.
it's closing the doors, because once you get an undetermined, the police are closing the doors, they're closing the files. You don't get victim support services because it's not considered a homicide.
Right.
You don't, you don't get access to, we, I guess you could say, some of the, the justice. You don't even have a
The
chance to,
acknowledgement.
the acknowledgement. You don't even have a chance to, sit with the person who has done you harm and say to them, this is what you've done, or we know this is what you could have done, because
Or
the system,
potentially stop them from doing it to someone else.
yeah. And from, we're fortunate enough to have grassroots community and voices that wrap their services around us, because they know that we know. So they don't need an autopsy report to tell them that she was murdered. They know. Yeah.
Right.
So those services,
And
stories are imperative. They're essential.
for sure. And I mean, that's the thing too, like thinking about what you're talking about and thinking about like the truth telling, right? It's almost like, I almost feel like it's such a colonial idea that it's almost as if we need proof. Do you know what I mean? Like it's
Mm,
that colonial idea that
yeah.
that you need to prove to us. And I don't know for how many years, for how long I lived in fear of not being believed. Do you know what I mean? With like my truth, with me and my sister, our story of our mother, and the fact that that's such a colonial idea that we need proof, right? So when you talk about those grassroots movements, they come and they say, come be a part of our circle, right? It's not, and you don't have that feeling of oh, well, what if they don't believe me, because you're speaking and honoring your truth, your grandbaby's truth, right? And like where I would honor my mother's truth. And yeah, I'm so
And it's
happy that you came
essential.
to share today. Like it's very close to my heart, and the fact that our stories are so similar in that sense, I think it's super important for the listeners. So
Yeah.
I guess I think we are kind of moving closer to the end of the show. So I was wanting to have maybe a short discussion on accountability. I know that has been something we've discussed in the past about accountability and accountability of systems, right? So you've talked about touching on policing, touching on the medical examiner's reporting, even with the national inquiry, like what do you feel, or what are your ideas on accountability for systems relating to MMIWG?
Well, I think accountability needs to be done from that prevention lens as well as the intervention. And when I think about prevention, I think about like our stories. Like we're here telling you this could happen to somebody else. Take
Right.
it, use it, make changes. It's essential to ensure that there are compliance programs that are effective but not harmful to a specific group of people. And we are a specific group of people. We have loved ones whose deaths have been deemed undetermined. So we have fallen through the cracks within that government system, that Western way. So a culture of accountability from all levels of government and for all circles of people who work within governing bodies, they require active monitoring and enforcing, when they do something wrong or when they're not doing their job, or be comfortable in the uncomfortableness of questioning that maybe your system is not working, so how can we change it?
Right.
your system is exclusive to certain bodies and are continuously perpetuating violence on Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited people.
Right.
And you may not be putting your hands on their bodies, but you're allowing people to get away with it by not enforcing, or actively monitoring those different systems that we are coming in contact with. And you're creating, you're breaking spirits. You're making it very challenging. So, ensuring that we all play a part in that. And I think when we come together and we talk the way we talk, and we educate and we bring awareness, pointing the finger in that way at the medical examiners, not like, hey, okay, you're doing this, you're doing this. How can we help you understand what you're doing and how it impacts our lives?
Right.
Yeah.
Definitely. I think, I mean, just for me, that's when I talk about the issue of MMIWG2S, that's where my thoughts constantly go: accountability. Because really, when especially when I'm looking at my research and looking at the broadly at the topic, it goes back to all of the systems. And it's like, there's so many different people in that, like even within your, like, there's just subsections, right? Of like, your story is different from my story. And there's how many people impacted. And there's all of these different players or these different actors that are working within those systems. Like, that's where it needs to be. Like, we need to be looking at accountability for these systems, whether it's policing, whether it's medical examiners, whether it's government. I definitely can't agree with you more in specifically looking at those governmental bodies, right? And trying to get that change, that accountability, really held accountability. So I guess moving to my final question, which is really about suggestions. You're a super strong advocate. You've been doing this work for some time, and even just working in the community, doing all the things that you do. So what would you suggest for people who want to get involved, who want to try to take action or to do something, positive in regards to MMIWG?
I think connecting with community and reaching out to family. And we don't have to wait until somebody goes missing or they're murdered. If you want to make an impact, it begins by especially looking into those prevention spaces and creating and making spaces. And also help create a culture of accountability. If you have somebody in your home and they're doing harm to somebody else, that, then what are you going to do about it? If you're walking down the street and if you see somebody being harmed by, whether it be a police officer or just, somebody else harming another person, keep yourself safe, but don't be a standbyer. If you're in a workplace that serves an Indigenous community or Indigenous women and girls, and that there's systems in there that are not working but that are creating more harm, question that.
Right.
Find a way to be an ally. And if you are an Indigenous person working in those systems, it's a tough system. And we have so many sisters and brothers working in those systems. Keep going and know that we're out here doing what we're doing, and respect the different circles and the different work that's going on. And find your place in that, because we could never have more than enough support or love or protection for our loved ones.
For sure. You talking to you, Angela, like, you always make me feel so heartwarmed. Like, just, it's so, your suggestions are just, I can't agree with her more. Is just going out there and really trying to connect like that. To me, it just warms my heart to think of. Yeah, it's so sweet. I'm so happy that you came here and shared today.
I'm so happy to. And thank you to, your beautifulness and, the way that you're doing this work. I love it. I love what you're doing.
We're all trying to work to the best of our ability, right? And
Yeah.
I mean, that's really what it is taking that responsibility, taking that action and saying like, what is my role in this, right? And I mean, for me, I mean, I always want to say too, like, I'm recognizing that, you know, in this way, it's almost selfish of me, right? Because it's a part of my own healing that I do, reaching out to other people like myself who have similar stories to mine, trying to help address the problems that at one time impacted me or are still impacting me, right? And I mean, even if there's people out there, you know, you mentioned allies, if there's people out there who don't have firsthand lived experience or don't recognize, we all want our world to be good, right? We want our future to be bright for our children. So I mean, helping everybody and giving everybody a helping hand, like sounds like a utopian world, right? But yeah, I guess that's my final thought. What's your final thought? I always like to leave the listeners with a final thought from the guest.
I think my final thought, I think it just comes from the heart, and, you know, is as dark as a lot of our experiences are, that we find a way to create beauty out of all of that.
Right.
And, you know, finding that beauty in all of our imperfections and finding a way to be okay with that. So everybody, especially our Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited, knowing that they all matter.
For sure.
Like, you matter. Zaylin matters. Your mom matters.
Mm-hmm.
They matter.
Oh, thank you so much, Angela. Very nice final thoughts for today. Thanks so much, Angela. It's been Angela Lavallee, my guest here on the show today. So you're still tuned into CKUW 95.9 FM. I'm Tammy Wolf, the host of Truth Before Reconciliation. I hope you guys enjoyed today's show. Please do come back again next week. Today was the 5th installment of the series on MMIWG2S. We will be having another guest come back next week to continue our series here on this very, very important topic. So thanks so much.